All right, guys, this next video is going to be a long one. Please look down in the description below to find out where you want to be. Please don't complain about how long it is. You know, when I get on my soapbox, I just got to tell you guys how it is based on my own experiences because I love helping people. And if any of this stuff helps you out, let me know at the end of the video or wherever in the video in the comments below. You know, I've been thinking to myself that photographers do not get enough credit for troubleshooting and operating cameras, but more importantly, the camera lenses themselves. And I blame cell phones because cell phone camera lenses or cameras, they don't really cost that much. And they don't really tell you what the photographers are going through when they're actually operating real lenses, fast glass, and all these other things. More importantly, they don't tell you when these expensive pieces of glasses break. Your 24 to 70, your 70 to 200, your 600 millimeter primes, your 800 millimeter primes, your 500 millimeter primes, any fast glass over 2.8 that's super expensive. Tens of thousands of dollars go into making these amazing optics. And it takes someone with the willingness to learn these optics to not only be able to operate them, but also troubleshoot them. But I really want to focus on the troubleshooting of the lens today. And one thing you have to understand is that lenses aren't as simple as they may look to the average person. Now, most of the time lenses, especially if used by a pro, they're going to have like bigger sized lenses with some buttons on the side, but they pretty much look simple from the outside. But sometimes these lenses, they just break or they just do not operate. And it doesn't take a lot to break them. And sometimes you can't even see that from the outside of the lens. Now think to yourself, you got a lens that's worth $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, and it's not operating correctly, or you don't even know that it's broken and you're still operating them. So I have a list of things to show you guys and explain to you guys what you could do to troubleshoot, but more importantly, what to look out for if you have a lens that you suspect of being broken. The first thing you need to think about is if you dropped it. Did you drop your lens? Because even if you dropped your lens, I mean, other than the obvious stuff like is the glass broken, is the lens filter broken, the internal mechanisms could be broken. Maybe a computer chip on the inside might be broken. But on the inside of the lens, and I'm going to repeat this later, it has a lot of plastics and pieces of rubber that when you go to zoom in and zoom out and focus in and out, that when you use those little turning knobs, that the pieces of plastic can get they can get broken. They're in the shape of a gear. So they have little teeth that go up and down like a transmission in a car. And when you drop these things, these little teeth could either break or rupture. And even though the lens might still be operating, it might not be operating as the manufacturer intended it to operate. So know if you dropped it that your lens might not be 100%. The next thing is, did you try your zoom ring or your focus ring, and are they zooming and focusing the way they should be? Now, most lenses have an autofocus and a manual focus option. Go ahead and click your lens back to manual focus. Go ahead and try to move it and make sure you get a nice throw. Make sure it's not catching, make sure it's not too stiff, or if you knew that it was very smooth before and it's not smooth now, these are things you need to be concerned about with the zoom ring or the focus ring. The next thing is to check your glass. If you dropped it, your glass might be broken, it might be cracked, it might not be in the right spot. It might be an external zooming lens and the glass doesn't come all the way out, or the glass is moving on the inside of the lens in a way that you know that wasn't right. Or you might actually shake your lens a little bit and notice that some things are moving that weren't moving inside the lens before. All these are bad symptoms. And I know it's hard to think about. And the reason why I'm making this video is I have two lenses that are broken right now. And one has a messed up aperture and one has a messed up focusing system for some reason. But I'll get into that a little bit later. The next thing on the list is you're trying to focus and you can't focus. Or, for example, my 24 to 70 Sigma Art lens can focus at wider focal lengths, but it can't focus at more telephoto focal lengths. So I was able to get 24 to 35 millimeters, but anything after 50 millimeters, my R5 was giving me a red box at focal lengths that I knew that it was supposed to be able to focus based on the distance that I was at with my camera. Now, you don't have to actually drop your lens for these things to happen. Some lenses, if you've been photographing for a long time, over 10 years especially, you know that lenses just over time, they start to show wear. And some of those signs of wear is worn rubber and worn plastics inside of the lens. You might be saying to yourself, well, Devin, my lens is all metal, this is an L lens. No. A lot of lenses, if not all lenses, have some kind of plastics and rubbers on the inside, and what this does is it dampens your movements. So when you're zooming in and zooming out, there's not like hard stops. It's a very smooth, and it gives you a very luxurious feel, like L lenses. A lot of L lenses actually have plastics and rubbers in them, so when the gears start meshing, it's a nice soft feel. It doesn't feel very rigid, and it helps you to zoom in and zoom out a lot quicker, but at the cost of having plastic and rubber inside of your lens that deteriorates over time, unfortunately. The next thing you need to think about is, do you have a DSLR or mirrorless camera, and how do they show you whether or not a lens is broken? For example, if you have a DSLR, some of the things that you might notice is that the focusing squares don't allow you to enact focus, or you won't hear that beep, or you won't see the focus square actually flash red where it's supposed to, or it might not even flash red at all, or it might give you an ERR code at the bottom like Nikon's. It usually gives you like an ERR, or you'll see it on the top screen, ERR, as if it tried to focus and it failed to focus. Sometimes you'll even get an error message. But on mirrorless cameras, sometimes you have eye tracking autofocus. You might think, wow, that's great to have. Yes, but you have to understand the colors that your mirrorless camera may give you. Typically, red is bad. For example, the R5 has servo AF is what they call it now. And it has one-shot mode or single-shot mode, where the single-shot mode, what it'll do is it'll just flash a green box over the thing that it accurately focused on. And as long as you didn't move back or forward, you can retain that focus and go ahead and release the shutter without having any out of focus images. But if you're in single shot mode and it doesn't even put a green box around, and you know you're in autofocus, you know your camera's in autofocus, and you know you're not in back button focus, or you didn't configure your camera in a way that your focus is different than it traditionally is, then you probably have some focusing issues. Or you take a picture and your camera thinks it focused. This is a bad one. Your camera thinks everything's in focus and it's actually not. This might be even a calibration issue on the DSLR side. Just a side note, DSLRs are calibrated because they have a separate sensor at the bottom of the lens or bottom of the camera, and it takes a signal from the lens, TTL, and it makes some more computations. So you have to calibrate because it has an extra step. And sometimes your lenses are just not calibrated, or from the actual manufacturer, it wasn't calibrated well. So especially with third-party lenses. So these are all things you need to think about, but DSLRs are distinctly different from mirrorless cameras and how they focus. Mirrorless cameras are really going to give you a better signal and an immediate signal that something's not right with the lens. You're going to get a big red box after it stops focusing or stops trying to focus. Whereas on the DSLR, sometimes it can focus hunt, and sometimes the lens can be broken, and it can look like two of the same symptoms, which is just the lens going in and out, in and out, in and out. Or now that you understand that DSLRs have all the focus points crammed in the middle. Sometimes you think you're on a point of contrast, so you're able to focus on something, but you're not, and the DSLR doesn't have a really good way of showing you that because all the focus points are crammed in the middle. Unlike mirrorless cameras where focus points are all over the screen and you can really dial in to the point of an eye where you want to focus on, and sometimes it can do that automatically. One thing you want to watch out for on the mirrorless side of things when your lens is broken is having your camera do everything and not checking over your camera. Once you take a picture, if you even remotely suspect that it's out of focus, whether your lens works or it doesn't, you should always be going through and reviewing your images, zooming into those extremities like hands, eyes, and eyes are not extremities, but eyes are something that we focus on a lot. So you need to be zooming into eyes, extremities that move a lot like hands and feet, your head sometimes, and making sure whatever you put your focus point on or whatever you're trying to focus on is in focus and not just motion blur because of shutter speed. And trying your best not to blame the lens for something that it didn't do. Make sure that you have everything that you need all locked in. And I'll get into that in just a moment. The next thing I want to talk about is try manual focusing. If you're trying to manual focus and your lens does not move when you turn that manual focus ring, and you got to have it in manual focus, because some lenses don't actually allow you to manually focus without putting it in manual focus on the lens. You might put it in manual focus on the camera, but you didn't put it in manual focus on the lens. Therefore, your lens might get damaged because you have an autofocus and you're trying to override it. Now, more expensive lenses like L lenses, G Masters, all these, higher end lenses, they are able to be overwritten with their autofocus. You can just go ahead and autofocus. Some lenses, like on the Nikon side of things, you have autofocus, you have manual override, which is like MO, and then you have manual focus. So you have a switch just dedicated to manually overriding your lens. So it'll be in autofocus until you turn that lens. So you want to make sure you understand what lens you have. Go ahead and try to manually focus. But if it does not manually focus, by moving that glass to the distance that you need it to be, chances are it's broken. Lenses should always be able to be manually focused, especially autofocus lenses. 100% manual lenses typically have like either an aperture ring or just a focus ring for you to be able to focus it the way you need to. But you should be always able to move that glass. The reason why I say it's important for autofocus glass to be able to be manual focused, because a lot of times when you're in that automatic focus by wire or however you're focusing and whatever method that lens is using, it's hard for you to tell whether or not automatic is still enacted or it's in manual focus. Some lenses don't even give you the button to actually change it. You have to change it in the camera, and then it translates that to the lens. So you have to really understand your lens. Understand that if you don't have the button, you need to get that thing in manual focus and try to manually focus it if you suspect that it's broken. If it's in autofocus and you have a switch, go ahead and switch it back to manual focus. Even if it has autofocus override, go ahead and try to move that lens with the focusing wheel. If it starts moving, you at least are able to take a picture that's in focus. Hopefully it moves throughout the entire focal range or the focusing range of that lens. The next thing you want to think about is, can you release the shutter of your camera and autofocus the lens? Now, if you have a full manual focusing lens, you don't have to worry about releasing the shutter, because the camera shutter will release regardless if you have a full manual lens. Also, if you're shooting back button focus, which means you're not focusing with the shutter button in the front, you're using the back button to focus, or another button on your camera to focus in AI servo or servo AF or continuous autofocus, then releasing the shutter with the front button, you have to make sure that you're trying to enact the focus to actually take the picture, and not blaming the lens because you forgot to enact focus on the button, or the button might be the culprit, not the lens. So these are things you want to think about when you're actually trying to focus and trying to get the shutter to release. If it's in manual focus, it's always going to release. If it's in back button focus, it's always going to release if you don't press that back button to focus. If you're in autofocus and you try to release the shutter, if it's failing to focus, it will not focus. Also, another reason why a camera won't release the shutter is because it cannot expose. Either it's too dark, or whatever you're trying to take a picture of is just not working out for some reason, or it's too bright. If you can't do that and you have your button set to auto exposure or exposure metering from that front button, that's another reason why your camera won't take a picture. It might not be because your lens is broken. The next thing you need to think about is, can you mount the lens? This is a funny one, but a lot of people, when they drop lenses, or when they put a lot of, like, I want to say adapters and connectors on the back of the lens, over time doing that could bend your lens's mount. One time I was using the 80-200 and I let a friend borrow it, and then I guess maybe my friend dropped it or something happened to where when my friend brought it back to me, the actual mount itself was just a little bit bent. So when I went to try to put it on there, now I've been mounting lenses for quite a while now. I know the field points, I know the little red to red, white to white dot, and lock your lens into place. I don't even have to look at the camera. I can just feel it. And I could feel that everything was tight. It wouldn't even get and latch onto the EF-RF adapter. So I looked at the lens really, really carefully, and then I noticed that it was a little bit bent in a certain spot. I did a lot of troubleshooting, but it took me a while to find where exactly. And it was just a small little snag, but it was too tight for me to actually turn the lens, even though I know the lens got flat on the body. So that's something you need to watch out for. Sometimes when you drop the lens and you drop the lens on its mount, the mount can break and you can't attach that lens to the camera. Trust me, photographers have a lot to worry about, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Do you get an error code is the next thing I want to talk about. If you get an error code, obviously your camera notices there's something wrong. Typically when you get an error code, there's something internally wrong with your lens. Either the contacts, sometimes it'll say, hey, the contacts on the lens, I'm not creating a good contact with the lens to be able to control the aperture, control the focus, and get any kind of image information from this lens. So you need to clean the contacts. Those are those contacts. They look like little gold conductors on the back of your lens. You want to go ahead and clean those off. You want to make sure that they're nice and clean, and that your camera can actually send an electrical charge through your lens to actually understand and communicate what the lens is trying to tell it. If you do have an issue like that, you could also be experiencing something so for example, if you adapt a lens or you convert or speed boost a lens, that means you have another optic in between your camera and the lens itself. A lot of times what can happen is your camera's like, I don't recognize this because you have another piece of glass in front of your glass. Sometimes it's not tight enough. Sometimes you didn't lock that the mount together. Sometimes it just does not want to cooperate with it. Sometimes you have to go into your menu system and tell it, hey, I want you to activate the camera even if you don't have a lens attached to it. And a lot of camera manufacturers like Panasonic, Canon, Sony, they call it something different, but you should be able to tell the camera in the system to activate or operate a lens without a lens being attached. It's something weird, but usually full manual lenses tend to throw this error code because you can't control the aperture on full manual lenses a lot, or you have an aperture control dial on the lens, and some older cameras don't understand that. So the f-stop will be at 0, 0, but you can still actually take pictures by manually focusing and manually controlling the aperture. But you have to go in the menu system and tell it, hey, activate the camera even if it doesn't have a lens on the front of it, because sometimes you even have a converter, speed booster, or an adapter that the lens that's its third party and that the camera does not recognize it to be a lens. The next thing you need to think about is, did you check and clean the contacts? You want to check and clean the contacts, make sure the contacts are still attached. You want to make sure that if you went out to the beach or anything that has a strange weather climate, or it was humid, or it was wet outside, or you got outside and your lens just fogged up or something like that, you want to make sure that all that stuff is cleaned off. Make sure that none of that stuff is still on the lens when you go to operate it, because guess what? It's going to have issues. For example, I was out photographing a homecoming and it started to rain, and I was using the 80-200 shooting football, and it was raining a lot. Like, I'm talking about cover my camera, take the pictures, keep my lens hood on so the raindrops won't get into it and mess it up too bad, take my lens cloth off. It was that bad. Like, it was like, you know, tornado, well, not tornado bad, but what do they call the flash flood warning bad? Like, you know, you're kicking up water from your boots kind of bad. Well, I was photographing in that situation, and even though I was covering my camera, apparently some water got in between the contacts and my EF-RF adapter. Now, over time, the weather sealing gasket is only like a $120 adapter. So over time, that weather sealing gasket starts to get cracks and it starts to peel off. So it's no longer weather sealed that great between the actual camera and the adapter and the lens itself. So I had to take that off, clean all the contacts out and stuff like that. Mind you, it's still raining, so I had to get under something, go under my jacket, do all these other things, because I'm still missing the moment if I don't get this stuff together. And it didn't really affect me until after the day was over. The next day, when different climates start to affect my camera bag and all these other things. I'm on my soapbox, but this is just some of the things that can happen that can keep you from actually being able to activate your lens. The next thing is your focus indicator. A lot of camera lenses have like a little meter, a focus meter indicator that tells you how far you are from the subject when you lock focus. So when you lock focus, it'll say 3 feet, 6 feet, 7 feet, or sometimes you'll look at the meter side, depending on what side of the world you're on and what unit of measurement you guys use. But if that little meter isn't moving in a somewhat fast fashion when you go to focus at a reasonable distance, say for example, you go from a very close focal distance, maybe something macro, and then you go all the way out to infinity. That thing needs to be spinning and it needs to be showing you accurate distances. What you can do is take a tape measure and go from your sensor's actual marking and measure from that to whatever you focused on. So the face of your subject to your actual sensor's marking to make sure that your lens is actually getting an accurate distance. If you're only 3 feet from your subject and your lens is saying, hey, you're 7 feet from the subject and that's what I focused on, but you focused on the image at 3 feet, but it's not exactly in focus, chances are that meter is telling you that the lens is not focusing at the correct distance. You should be able to actually focus your lens at that same distance. As long as your sensor is the exact same distance that you measured and you're looking at your lens and you're manually focusing, you should be able to actually do it without autofocusing. I know we're in a world of autofocus, but you should be able to actually manually focus by using that distance meter somewhat and get somewhat close. If you're way off or that distance meter is not even moving when you go to focus and you know it needs to be spinning, that lens needs to be spinning to get you your autofocus in most cases, depending on how far and how close you are to your subject. If you already lock focus on your subject, it's not going to move anymore. If you're too close to your subject, it won't focus at all because every lens has a minimum and maximum focusing distance. And we'll get into that in just a minute. This next one is pretty redundant, but do you have an adapter? Do you have any kind of extension tubes, extenders on there that they can be broken and not actually your lens? Lenses cost a lot of money. The last thing I want to know is that if I have a 2x extender on my lens and I'm using my lens and it stops working and I take my lens in to get fixed, come to find out it's my 2x, 4x adapter. I'd rather my extender or the adapter that goes on front of my lens is the culprit and not the lens itself because it's probably a lot cheaper to get your extender fixed than your lens itself, or I can just use it without the extender and just crop if I need to sometimes in a pinch. All right, so the next thing you want to think about is when was the last time it was working? Troubleshoot by going through the steps. Did it break? Was it in a tight situation? How old is the lens? Because the lens is too old. When it was working, it was good. When it gets too old and everything starts to wear and break down, it might not start working. Or it might just stop working just because it's old. Does your settings line up to what you're expecting your camera to do when it comes to focusing? This is going back to what I said earlier about back button focus, making sure that you know you have it in back button focus and that you changed your buttons around. Are you at the right focal length to actually photograph that image that you're taking? How close is your minimum focusing distance? Are you focusing on something with contrast? Like if you were focusing on my t-shirt or my polo here, you would have to focus on something with contrast, like here where my long john comes in or right here where this logo comes in. You won't be able to focus on something that's completely black. So if you put your focus point there, expect if you don't have any kind of contrast or texture, your camera won't focus. And it's not just your lens. It's just your lack of ability to set your camera up in a way, either your internal settings or what you're physically doing with your camera to actually achieve focus. It's not your lens in that case. Did you mount your lens on the correct camera? Now, this is a very controversial one because third-party lenses typically mount on the crop frame sensor and the full frame sensor camera. So if I had a Canon 90D and a Canon R5, I could put pretty much almost any Sigma lens on there as long as it was made for Canon. But when I mount that lens, that's crop sensor onto the full frame body, I will get a heavy vignette because crop frame sensors are not, the actual lenses are not designed to cover the full frame sensor light pattern, so to speak. So basically crop frame sensor lenses can't cover the full frame. Full frame lenses can cover the entire image of a crop frame body, which makes sense because the lenses are bigger. They cast a bigger image. The crop frame sensor is just going to cut into that image a little bit, but you won't get any vignetting at wider focal lengths. So for example, a famous lens was the 18 to 35 1.8 lens, but it was only designed for crop sensors. But since it was a Sigma lens, you could put that crop censored lens on a full frame body. A lot of people like to use the 5D Mark IV with the 18 to 35 crop sensor lens because the 5D Mark IV cropped its full frame when it was in 4K and other video formats. So it was just, I want to say, a loophole, so to speak, that you can get a fast glass or some fast glass and put it on a 5D Mark IV and not have any vignetting because it was a crop frame censored lens. You want to make sure you have the right lens for the job. You want to make sure that it covers the full frame and it doesn't vignette at wider angles like 18 millimeters, 24 millimeters, and anything in between or wider than that, because chances are you might have the wrong lens for the wrong body. Just because it is a Canon branded lens or a Canon mounted lens doesn't mean you have the right frame sensor to put on that lens. And just because it's a Canon lens, and a lot of crop frame censored Canon lenses don't fit on full frame bodies, the actual third party lenses can actually fit on, even if they're crop frame, can still in some cases fit on the full frame body. I know that's kind of confusing, but you just want to have the right full frame or crop frame lens for your camera body. And it's not necessarily the camera's fault that that's the case, if that makes sense to you. You want to have a mount / adapter mount that works, or teleconverter / SpeedBooster. Anything that you put between your lens and your camera to amplify the lens or to utilize the lens, you want to make sure that works also appropriately with your camera. Just because you have a camera lens on an adapter or a SpeedBooster doesn't mean that they're going to work well together, especially if it's third party. Even if that third party says, hey, we're going to work well together. Sometimes the camera manufacturers don't let the third party manufacturers access their lenses, their schematics, or anything that they utilize for their camera brand. For example, Canon is notorious for not allowing third parties to access their lens mounts. Even though you might have some third party Canon lenses like the Viltrox RF, the Samyang RF lenses, they had those lenses come out. But the firmware with the R5 is probably not sufficing, or it's not going with those third-party lenses. Canon is probably going to make firmware that matches up with the Canon branded lenses and not necessarily the third-party Samyang, Roca 9, Sigma, Tamron, and all those lenses, because they're competing. They really want you to buy their lenses with their cameras. But now Canon has now reenacted the permissions to use their RF mount, and now Sigma, Tamron, all these other manufacturers should be making more lenses. I think Sigma has already made crop frame lenses for the cameras, but you have to understand that the older lenses might be behind. They might not focus well. They might not operate the way that you think they should. And when you update your firmware, expect maybe sometimes even those lenses might break your camera. And what I mean by that is that sometimes you go to focus or you use the electronic shutter and it tries to communicate with your lens and something doesn't go right, it starts hunting, it starts freaking out because that's not a lens that was available when the firmware update was made, if that makes sense. So they're not communicating with the companies well to give them enough information to accurately use maybe eye tracking autofocus. Maybe the entire frame of your image is not able to be utilized for focusing. Maybe you can only use the middle of the camera's focusing view to, or field of view to actually focus in, because that's just a firmware software issue. So check your filters and all of your attachments. If you have a ND filter that's variable, or a variable ND filter, a polarizer, a circular polarizer filter, anything on the front of your lens that could change how it's supposed to operate, make sure you check for that. Make sure that that's not causing you any issues. For example, if you have a variable ND filter, my students are big culprits of this, is that if you have a variable ND filter, if you have it maxed out all the way to its darkest settings, your camera won't focus. Even if you see a bright setting in front of you and you think your settings is correct, or your ISO is too high or anything, it won't focus in dark situations, because that's how mirrorless and DSLRs can't focus in very, very, very dark situations. but it might be not be dark around you. You're like, why is my lens acting up? You might have a variable ND filter adapter in between it or in front of it that's keeping it from focusing correctly, and it might not be the lens's fault. So that's something to think about as well. Do you have a lens cap in front of your lens? Chances are, if you have a lens cap, that lens cap doesn't have any contrast, or it's way too close to the lens to focus on, so your lens won't operate correctly. Your camera won't expose correctly because you left your lens cap on. Does your camera have an extreme shutter count? If your camera has anywhere over 100,000, if it's an older camera, 100,000 shutter counts, or if your camera has 500,000 or more shutter counts, chances are you might have a broken shutter, especially on a DSLR. Mirrorless cameras, I haven't heard of any broken shutters based on physical performance. I hear that the shutters break on a lot of Canon mirrorless cameras because some software issues, something like that happened. My friend had to take his R5 to Canon a few times because they said the shutter was broken, so they fixed it. Maybe it's electronic shutter, maybe it's a mechanical shutter. I don't know, but usually when I'm talking about that shutter count, I'm talking about the mechanical shutter. But since we have an electronic shutter, they can share the load, so to speak. But I don't know how it affects these new mirrorless cameras. That was something I was concerned about. But your lens won't activate. So your lens won't activate because your shutter's broken or something like that. Usually mirrorless cameras will flash up an error, but I'm not always certain about that. And I don't think Canon is giving a lot of information on what to expect from your camera when it has these issues. Also, here's another little tidbit of fact. If you have an older lens, expect Canon, Nikon, Sony, the major manufacturers, to not take it after like 10 years. After 10 years, the manufacturers just probably won't even fix it. This happened to me. And the last two is one, aperture value accuracy. You want to make sure that your aperture value is the aperture value that you selected in your lens. That's why it's important to know the exposure triangle, because if you set your lens to f2.8 and you're getting an f11 exposure back from your camera, or everything's dark, or your aperture is moving intermittently, which means your aperture is just moving and making the image brighter and darker without you doing anything, like my Sigma EF 50mm art lens, then chances are your aperture is actually going bad. I've had this happen in a few of my camera lenses, but essentially the aperture is comprised of aperture blades, and these aperture blades are supposed to work together and they adjust based on what you have in your camera digitally. So if you have f2.8, 5.6, 6.3, 7.1, f8, 11, all these apertures are supposed to react digitally, but sometimes you'll take a picture. For example, when I'm using my 50mm art lens, you'll take a picture, and when you take that picture, you can hear some kind of soft movement inside the lens every time you release your shutter. Now, remember, when you release your shutter, typically it only does two things: focus and meter exposure. That means it's doing all these calculations. Well, I have back button focus on my camera always enacted, but when I go to take a picture, I can still hear the shutter only on this lens, or excuse me, the aperture, adjusting when I've already adjusted it to its correct aperture value. So that tells me when I take the picture, it's wildly overexposed, even though the exposure meter told me that it was supposed to be exposed, or the live viewfinder is telling me that everything is exposed. But when I go to take the picture, it's wildly overexposed and I can hear the aperture moving. That tells me the aperture is just not working correctly and it needs to be replaced. The next thing is you want to make sure your exposure is accurate. This kind of goes back to aperture, but you want to make sure that you have your exposure triangle all in the right place. That means your shutter speed needs to be accurate, your aperture needs to be accurate, and your ISO value needs to be accurate. You need to have a good feeling for what's overexposed and what's underexposed. And just because you might not be getting the correct exposure does not mean your lens is sending wrong or bad information, or that your aperture is not operating correctly. Because the only way the lens can control exposure is because of the aperture. And chances are, if you're getting the wrong exposure due to your lens, it's because your aperture is broken. But you want to make sure that you know your exposure settings and that they're accurate to something that's realistic coming out of the camera, and that everything is, so to speak, all together. I'm Devin with CFX Studios TV. I know this was a long video. Thanks for hanging around. I didn't think it was going to be this long of a video. I just thought I might bring this up because my 50 Sigma EF art lens is broken and my 24-70 Sigma EF lens is broken. And both of these, to my knowledge, have not gotten dropped recently. They were both used lenses and they're older lenses, so there's no warranty on them or anything like that. So I have to get them fixed out of my own pocket, and it's going to be a pain. I do have a 24-105 f4 that can cover for those ranges for now, but it's not as fast as those lenses. Stay tuned for the next video.